What if the world we know is only the last faint echo of something older, something that slipped between epochs like a forgotten breath? Sometimes, in the quiet edges of night, you sense it, an absence too large to name, as though entire histories once stood where now there is only dust. The ruins, the myths, the fragments, they do not speak clearly, yet they lean toward us like half-erased memories asking to be remembered. So let yourself drift, unguarded, and follow this thin thread of doubt into the dark. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It begins as a faint dissonance, the kind that lingers at the edge of a familiar story where something does not quite fit, where a thread seems pulled from the tapestry long ago, leaving behind a shape that feels wrong only when looked at under a certain light. You might notice it when you compare timelines from different civilizations and see the same flood, the same fire, the same fall repeated in layers, as though the world were caught in a cycle of forgetting. Or when archaeologists brush dust from an object that should not exist where it lies, shaped by hands that should not have known how to create it. These fractures in the narrative grow sharper the more you follow them, and slowly a possibility emerges, quiet, uncomfortable, that our story may not be the first, that the ground beneath our feet might be the archive of forgotten worlds. The idea is not new. It surfaces in the writings of ancient philosophers, in the rhythms of myth, in the ruins that lie beneath other ruins. Even Plato, speaking through Critias and Solon, wrote about ages before memory, ages swallowed by water and time. He spoke of cataclysms that rose and fell like the breath of the earth itself, wiping civilizations away so thoroughly that only the faintest mythic silhouettes remained. Scholars today debate the literal truth of such accounts, arguing whether they reflect geological events or symbolic cycles. Yet the echoes persist, repeating from culture to culture. The Maya spoke of previous worlds destroyed and remade, each an experiment of creation. The Hindus described vast yugas stretching over ages, with humanity appearing again and again under different skies. Sumerian tablets list kings who reigned for thousands of years before the flood, men whose spans of rule defy biological sense yet appear carved into baked clay, unblinking across 5 millennia. What unsettles is not any single claim but the recurrence of the same pattern. When scattered traditions imagine themselves as latecomers to a much older sequence, one wonders whether they might be holding on to the sparse remnants of a truth once widely known but later erased. And if such civilizations truly came before us, where are their traces? This question becomes more complex the moment you begin to look for the missing layers in the earth itself. There are archaeological deposits where expected debris layers vanish, where periods of development appear to accelerate unnaturally, or where the tools found in one stratum belong to a level that should have dissolved long before. Often these anomalies are labelled outliers, mistakes, or curiosities. But when enough curiosities accumulate, they start forming a pattern of their own. Consider Göbekli Tepe. Its carved pillars, arranged in circular enclosures, date back to around 9600 BCE, far older than what traditional narratives claim for complex architectural or symbolic societies. For decades, textbooks insisted that agriculture came first, and monumental architecture followed. Yet the site's existence flips that logic. Here were sculpted limestone pillars, some weighing over 20 tons, created by hunter-gatherers who were supposedly too focused on survival to imagine such structures. The discovery forced archaeologists to reconsider the trajectory of human development, but the deeper question remained untouched. If a site of this sophistication existed at the end of the last ice age, how many others were swallowed by rising seas during meltwater pulses, or buried beneath layers of prehistory? Meltwater Pulse 1b, for instance, raised sea levels dramatically around 11,500 years ago, flooding continental shelves that once held landscapes as large as nations. Whole regions along the coasts of India, Southeast Asia, and the Americas vanished beneath the waves. The submerged city near Dwarka, with its grid-like foundations and stone structures, hints at what may lie underwater elsewhere. Marine archaeologists have mapped ancient river systems now drowned, suggesting that early populations lived along these fertile banks. If settlements once lined these coastlines, they would now lie hundreds of meters underwater, far beyond easy excavation. What we know of prehistory comes from the small fraction of land not swallowed by ocean or stripped by erosion. The rest lies in darkness. But perhaps the more intriguing clue resides not in the depths of the oceans, but in the layers of mythic memory. Many indigenous cultures preserve stories of a sky that once looked different, of stars shifting, of suns falling, of periods when the world became uninhabitable. The Aboriginal Australians speak of times before the current landscape was shaped, of great floods and fires that marked transitions between worlds. The Dogon of Mali hold astronomical knowledge about the Sirius star system that, by conventional reasoning, they should not have possessed without telescopes, knowledge that has sparked fierce academic debate for decades. Some anthropologists argue that this insight could have been introduced through contact with outsiders. Others suggest symbolic misinterpretation. But the uncertainty itself hints at deeper complexities in the transmission of ancient knowledge. Consider, too, the structure of global myth, the recurring motif of a lost golden age, the rise and fall of civilizing gods or culture bringers, and the memory of an earlier humanity erased by disaster. These stories appear enduring and widespread enough to provoke curiosity. Were they metaphors born from human fear of the unknown, or do they preserve faint recollections of cycles long past? And if they do preserve memory, how much survives after thousands of years of oral transmission? Some myths describe subterranean realms, others celestial refuges. Still others describe migrations across continents now unrecognizable. All these fragments fit like broken tiles of a mosaic whose original image is now lost. The geological record offers its own cryptic contributions. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, still debated, proposes that fragments of a comet may have struck Earth around 12,800 years ago, triggering rapid cooling, megafaunal extinctions, and widespread environmental destruction. If such an event occurred, it could have disrupted any early civilizations living at the time, forcing survivors into scattered refugees, erasing knowledge, breaking chains of continuity. There are burn layers in North America, deposits richer in platinum than surrounding strata, and patterns of melt glass found in multiple locations, materials that some researchers argue could result from high-energy events. Whether or not the hypothesis proves true, the evidence invites contemplation of how fragile civilization can be, how easily knowledge can vanish in the face of sudden upheaval. And then there is the puzzle of human origins. Genetic research shows that Homo sapiens underwent population bottlenecks, periods when numbers dropped so drastically that diversity shrank. The Toba supereruption around 74,000 years ago is often cited as a cause, though its impact remains debated. Some anthropologists propose cultural bottlenecks as well, periods when inherited knowledge collapsed and had to be rebuilt. Certain tool-making traditions appear and disappear abruptly in the archaeological record, suggesting movements or extinctions of cultural groups. If multiple resets occurred, whether through climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, celestial events, or pandemics, then it becomes easier to imagine how earlier cultures with complex knowledge could have risen and fallen without leaving clear traces. Across the world, anomalies surface in unexpected places. Ancient maps, such as the Piri race map, depict coastlines that were supposedly unknown to mapmakers of the era. The Orontius Phineus map has been argued, controversially, to show parts of Antarctica's coastline free of ice, though mainstream historians reject this interpretation. Yet even when interpretations differ, the idea persists that some ancient maps may have been copied from far older sources. And with each such possibility, another crack appears in the assumption that all sophisticated cartographic knowledge arose in the last few millennia. In Egypt, the erosion patterns on the Great Sphinx have sparked debates about its true age. Geologist Robert Schoch argues that the weathering on its enclosure suggests heavy rainfall from a period long before the accepted construction date, perhaps extending into an epoch when the climate of the Sahara was drastically wetter. Though this claim is widely contested, the debate itself suggests that there may be geological signals we have yet to interpret correctly. The layers of the past remain stubbornly ambiguous. A similar uncertainty surrounds the massive stones at Baalbek, some weighing over 800 tons, forming a trilithon whose placement defies simple explanation. Engineers debate how such blocks could have been quarried, moved, and positioned with ancient technology. Some propose that earlier cultures may have prepared the site long before the Romans built upon it. Others argue the quarrying was incomplete. But no definitive story forms, and the stones continue to stand like questions carved into the earth. These puzzles are not proofs. They are invitations to think more deeply. When viewed together, they create the faint outline of a possibility, that perhaps humanity has risen to complexity more than once, that perhaps what we call the first civilizations were themselves inheritors of something older, something nearly lost. The gaps in our record may not be mere accidents of preservation, but signs of a deeper pattern, cycles of rise and fall, memory and forgetting. And if this is true, then our position in the timeline becomes strangely fragile. We become not the first civilization, nor the last, but one moment in a sequence whose boundaries we cannot see. Yet such ideas carry a quiet tension. If earlier civilizations existed intentionally or not, their traces appear concealed, washed away, buried, overwritten. Some point to the role of institutions, empires that sought to control historical narratives, religious authorities that interpreted and reinterpreted texts, modern academic structures that favour established paradigms. But whether by accident or design, the result is the same, a story built from surviving fragments that may not reflect the whole. The missing chapters leave room for wonder and for unease. And so, as this possibility unfolds, another question arises, breathing with the softness of an old memory awakening. If humanity truly stands on the foundations of forgotten worlds, what shadows linger beneath us? What stories remain buried, waiting to be noticed not by force, but by those willing to listen gently to the silence between the known and the unknown? The answer waits somewhere in the dust, in the drowned coastlines, in the myths that whisper of days before days. But before touching those deeper layers, another thread emerges, faint but insistent, one that suggests certain clues may have survived in ways we do not yet understand, hidden not in stone, but in something even more enduring. And if that is true, then the path forward will require us to look not downward into the earth, but inward. There is a quiet strangeness in realizing that the most ancient archive we possess is not made of clay tablets or weathered stones, but something far smaller, far more intimate, woven into the structure of our bodies like a whisper carried across generations. When scientists first mapped the human genome, they expected a straightforward chronology of evolution, a gradual unfolding of inherited traits. Instead, they found something more tangled, more layered, as though humanity had drifted through multiple phases before arriving in the present. Among the most puzzling discoveries were segments of DNA that did not neatly belong to Homo sapiens alone, fragments inherited from other hominins long extinct. These traces, Neanderthal, Denisovan, and others still unidentified, suggest a deep history of interactions across populations that no written record remembers. Some anthropologists call these ghost lineages, for they appear in our genes but nowhere in the known fossil record. It is here, in this molecular palimpsest, that the possibility of forgotten worlds becomes less abstract. Our DNA does not merely describe what we are, it bears the faint echoes of what we used to be. The presence of Denisovan markers across Southeast Asia and Oceania hints at migrations and encounters that official chronologies still cannot fully explain. Even more mysterious are the so-called archaic introgressions, genetic signatures from hominins whose bones have never been found. These fragments imply that entire populations once lived, thrived, and vanished, leaving behind no physical trace but a whisper in our cells. If populations can disappear without fossils, then what of their cultures, their knowledge, their stories? What of the civilizations they might have formed before the Earth erased their homes? Some geneticists argue that memory cannot be transmitted biologically, that DNA carries no stories. Yet others point out that certain traits, fear responses, spatial preferences, even emotional patterns, may reflect ancestral experiences encoded epigenetically. Studies on trauma, particularly among descendants of catastrophic events, suggest that the body may indeed carry imprints of history. If this is true, then perhaps the collective unease that surfaces when humanity contemplates lost worlds is not purely imagination, but the faint echo of something once lived, something forgotten, something that shaped us before vanishing into the sediment of time. It is in this context that ancient myths about humanity's origins take on a new resonance. The Sumerians, whose tablets form some of the earliest known written records, did not describe themselves as the first people. They wrote of earlier ages, earlier kings, earlier beings who walked the earth before the Great Flood. Their king list divides time into epochs, with pre-flood rulers governing for spans that defy conventional interpretation. Some scholars dismiss these numbers as symbolic, metaphoric. Others note that the list insists on continuity, framing history not as invention but as inheritance. The question becomes, inheritance from whom? From a forgotten culture? From survivors of an earlier world? Or from memories carried in stories that outlived the civilizations that first told them? What deepens the perplexity is how widespread such memories are. In the Vilcabamba Valley of Ecuador, local traditions speak of an age when the ancestors possessed knowledge that was later lost, knowledge older than the mountains. In the Andaman Islands, oral traditions recount a time when the seas rose and covered lands that are now drowned. Aboriginal Australian songlines map landscapes that existed before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Paths now submerged beneath hundreds of meters of water. These accounts, once considered mythic, are now recognized as containing accurate memories of geological events that occurred thousands of years ago. If stories can preserve memories of coastlines long vanished, what other memories might they hold? Memories of societies erased not by imagination, but by catastrophe. This possibility leads inevitably to the greatest rupture known in recent geological history, the end of the Younger Dryas period. Around 11,600 years ago, temperatures rose sharply, glaciers retreated, and sea levels surged by more than 100 meters. Scientists still debate the causes: orbital cycles, freshwater pulses, or perhaps an extraterrestrial event, as some researchers propose. But whatever the mechanism, the effects were global and devastating. Entire ecosystems shifted, megafauna disappeared, human populations were forced to migrate, adapt, or collapse. If any coastal or low-lying civilizations existed before this event, their remnants would now lie beneath the waves. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by geologists Ryan and Pittman, suggests that a massive flood around 5600 BCE transformed a freshwater lake into the saltwater sea we know today. Their theory is controversial, yet the idea of sudden inundation is supported by submerged shorelines found deep beneath the surface. In the Mediterranean, similar submerged structures hint at ancient settlements now lost. The coastlines of Southeast Asia, once forming a vast landmass known as Sundaland, were swallowed as sea levels rose. Genetic studies of Southeast Asian populations show complex patterns of migration that align with the submergence of this ancient continent. Could Sundaland have been home to cultures that predate our known civilizations? The idea is speculative but not without basis. Even more curious is the alignment of global myths with these geological events. The Ogi-no-Mizu stories of Japan speak of great floods. The Tamil literature of South India recounts the destruction of Kumarikandam, a land to the south swallowed by the sea. Polynesian oral histories recount migrations prompted by the rising waters. When these stories are mapped against reconstructions of ancient shorelines, the correspondences are striking. It raises the possibility that myth may serve as a repository of pre-flood history. And if these myths recall real events, then the civilizations described within them may not be inventions, but memories of societies displaced by rising seas. Yet there is a more subtle category of evidence, one that does not shout, but murmurs from beneath layers of interpretation. It concerns the sudden appearance of monumental architecture after the end of the Ice Age. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, Navali Chori, and Karahan Tepe suggest a level of organization and symbolic sophistication that emerged too quickly to align with traditional models of gradual development. Some archaeologists propose that the builders of these sites possessed inherited knowledge, passed down through generations from earlier groups. Others argue that the knowledge may have been pieced together from scattered survivors of earlier settlements. In either case, the abruptness hints at an older lineage of ideas resurfacing after dormancy. Consider the stone spheres of Costa Rica, perfectly shaped and weighing several tons. Their purpose remains unknown, or the megalithic alignments of Nabta Playa, which predate Stonehenge by millennia and demonstrate precise knowledge of astronomical cycles. or the underwater stone structures near Yonaguni, whose natural or artificial nature remains fiercely debated. None of these prove the existence of lost civilizations, but collectively they suggest that early humans may have possessed knowledge that we do not fully understand, knowledge that appears suddenly, without clear developmental antecedents. What amplifies the mystery further is the global distribution of early astronomical alignments. The Carnac stones in France, the spherical megaliths of Scotland's recumbent stone circles, the Goseck circle in Germany, all appear within a narrow time frame after the Ice Age ended. Some researchers argue that their alignments correspond not only to solar cycles, but to precessional movements, a phenomenon requiring long-term observation across many generations. If this is true, then the knowledge encoded in these structures may reach back farther than the structures themselves. Even the design principles of ancient architecture suggest continuity, with deeper, perhaps older traditions. The use of cardinal orientations, the preference for specific proportions, the symbolic emphasis on thresholds and gateways, all recur across cultures in ways that exceed simple coincidence. Some anthropologists propose that these design principles reflect universal human cognition, but others point out that such universals are difficult to prove, and that similarities across continents may indicate shared inheritance, rather than independent invention. All of this leads to a quiet but persistent suspicion that humanity today may belong not to the first civilization, nor the second, nor even the third, but to a much later iteration. We may be the beneficiaries of knowledge passed through countless hands, distorted across epochs, fractured by catastrophe, simplified into myth, encoded into symbol, embedded in ritual, and whispered down the centuries until the original context dissolved completely. The stories of gods descending from the sky, of knowledge granted to early humans, of lost lands swallowed by oceans. These motifs recur so consistently that their persistence becomes a phenomenon in itself. But if we are indeed inheritors of fragments from earlier worlds, then there must be more clues, somewhere in the artifacts, the myths, the genetics, or the stones. And perhaps the next layer of evidence lies not in ancient caves or submerged coastlines, but in the strange coherence of patterns that appear too widespread, too synchronized to dismiss as coincidence. Patterns that hint at a network of knowledge spanning continents long before recorded history. And if such a network once existed, then its traces may still lie hidden, waiting for the quiet moment when someone finally recognizes the faint geometry beneath the noise. There is a certain stillness that settles over you when you realize that the oldest truths rarely survive in the form we expect. They do not sit preserved in monuments or temples or tablets, waiting to be read by those who come later. Instead, they drift through history like faint currents, altering the course of cultures without revealing their origins. When you begin to trace these currents, through symbols, through alignments, through fragments of knowledge that seem too synchronized for coincidence, you start to sense that the map of early humanity may be far more intricate than the textbooks allow. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the strange lattice of ancient structures scattered across the world, structures that appear connected not by trade or empire but by a more elusive form of transmission. Something older than writing, older than agriculture, older even than the broken memories of floods that haunt the earliest mythologies. It begins with patterns, not the simple patterns found in pottery or textiles, but something more quietly deliberate, the repetition of specific alignments, proportions, orientations and symbolic motifs across cultures that, by all conventional timelines, should never have shared influence. Take, for instance, the persistent fascination with the cardinal directions. Civilizations separated by continents and millennia oriented their most sacred constructions toward the rising sun, the solstices, the equinoxes, or the celestial poles. The Egyptians aligned the pyramids of Giza with extraordinary precision. The builders of Teotihuacan arranged their city upon a grid tilted slightly from true north. The ancient Chinese developed entire cosmologies around cardinality, linking each direction to elements, seasons, and celestial patterns. Even prehistoric sites like Newgrange in Ireland, or the mound complexes of Ohio, demonstrate a similar devotion to solar alignments. The conventional explanation is that humans everywhere share an instinctive reverence for the sky, that the sun and stars naturally shaped early ritual life. But the level of precision achieved at many of these sites complicates this assumption. Measurements taken at Stonehenge, Gosek, Chankillo and Nabta Playa reveal an understanding of astronomical cycles that would require consistent observation over centuries. These alignments do not represent casual interest, they reflect inherited knowledge. But where could that knowledge have originated? And how did it spread across continents separated by oceans in periods long before recognized global contact? Some archaeologists propose cultural diffusion through slow migrations. Others suggest independent development driven by universal human cognition. Yet as more prehistoric sites come to light, the similarities deepen. The presence of megalithic rings, standing stones, circular enclosures and star-oriented platforms emerges not as isolated inventions, but as a global tendency, appearing suddenly after the last ice age. It is as though humanity remembered something, some ancient framework of observation and meaning, yet retained only fragments. The original context, whatever it was, seems to have dissolved, leaving behind the skeleton of a system that no longer reveals its purpose. The more you look, the more uncanny these parallels become. Along the Atlantic facade, from Portugal to Ireland to Scotland, prehistoric builders erected massive stone circles whose arrangements reflect lunar and solar cycles with remarkable accuracy. But far across the world on the islands of the Pacific, the early Polynesians constructed stone platforms aligned to celestial events with equal precision. On the Andean Altiplano, the Tiwanaku civilization built the Kalasasaya temple with a solar alignment that marks solstices through slits in its walls, and in the deserts of North America, the Chacuan people laid out their great houses and roads along astronomically significant lines. These cultures did not share language, trade networks, or genetic lineages, yet they carried forward a similar architectural grammar, one that seems to gesture toward an intellectual inheritance older than themselves, an inheritance that may have passed not through written records, but through myth, ritual, or instinctive tradition. And the further back you trace these traditions, the more they converge toward a time when humanity had only recently emerged from the upheavals that reshaped the Earth. Rising seas, melting ice, shifting climates. If remnants of an earlier civilization survived those upheavals, they may have transmitted their knowledge not as a structured canon, but as shards embedded in the stories of the survivors. This possibility gains a quiet resonance when considering the peculiar distribution of ancient megaliths. There are over 50,000 megalithic structures in Europe alone, and yet mainstream chronologies place their construction long before the societies responsible possessed the social complexity normally associated with such feats. What is even more peculiar is that many early megaliths appear as though they were built not as innovations, but as recollections, structures echoing something remembered imperfectly. Their designs differ yet follow recognizable patterns, suggesting a symbolic language whose original meaning has faded. One of the most striking examples lies on the island of Malta. The megalithic temples, Hagar-Kim, Mnajra, Tarxian, predate the pyramids and Stonehenge and contain architectural features unlike anything else in the Mediterranean. Some scholars argue for an indigenous development. Others suggest influences from cultures that vanished before leaving clear traces. The temples incorporate curves, apse, and aligned doorways that hint at astronomical and symbolic significance, yet their origin remains elusive. Why did an island with limited resources produce structures of such sophistication so early? Where did the designers learn the principles underlying their construction? The question lingers, unanswered. Across the globe in Micronesia, the ancient city of Nan Madol rises from the sea, a lattice of artificial islets built from massive basalt logs. How these stones were transported and positioned remains unclear. Local traditions speak of a ruling class with mysterious abilities, but beyond the legends, the site stands as another reminder that humanity's early architectural achievements do not always fit comfortably within established timelines. The structures of Nan Madol resemble nothing in the surrounding region, prompting some researchers to consider whether its builders were heirs to an older tradition carried across the ocean. In South America, the precision of megalithic stonework at Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo and Pumapunku continues to provoke wonder. The interlocking blocks fitted without mortar resist explanation even with modern tools. The conventional timeline attributes these structures to cultures predating the Inca, but the exact identity of the builders remains uncertain. More intriguing is the presence of blocks that appear unfinished or abandoned, as though a catastrophic event interrupted their work. Geological surveys indicate that parts of these sites may have undergone seismic displacement, hinting at abrupt transitions that might correlate with ancient disasters. If you draw these sites on a map, an odd geometry begins to appear, a loose but perceptible pattern that arcs across continents. Some researchers, guided by the speculative but intriguing work of Alfred Watkins and others, have spoken of ancient alignments, or energy lines, though such terms often slip into the realm of pseudoscience. Yet the underlying observation remains. Many early sacred sites fall along lines that seem to follow not random placement, but intentional pathways. Whether these pathways reflect migratory routes, astronomical bearings, or memories encoded in ritual geography, the recurrence is difficult to ignore. What deepens the puzzle further is the presence of astronomical knowledge in societies that, according to orthodox chronology, should not have possessed the time or resources to make such observations. The builders of the Goseck Circle in Germany, dated to around 4900 BCE, aligned its gates to the winter solstice with impressive precision. The site predates the Egyptian pyramids by millennia. Further east, the ancient settlement of Archaeum, often called the Russian Stonehenge, reveals a similar mastery of solar and lunar cycles. Archaeological evidence suggests that its inhabitants practiced advanced metallurgy and maintained a complex social structure. Yet Archaeum appeared suddenly and disappeared just as abruptly, leaving no clear line of descent. Perhaps the most enigmatic system is the sophisticated astronomical knowledge embedded in the Vedic tradition. Long before the development of complex urban societies, early Indian texts record observations of precession, solstices, and star positions with remarkable accuracy. The Surya Siddhanta describes the length of the year with near-modern precision. Scholars debate whether these measurements arose from long-term indigenous observation or from knowledge inherited from earlier sources. But the continuity of such information, surviving through oral transmission for millennia, suggests that humanity may have once been part of a global web of observation and meaning that fractured during prehistoric upheavals. This brings us to a subtler point, the possibility that ancient knowledge did not spread through physical contact alone. Cultural anthropologists studying the diffusion of myths have identified patterns too consistent to ignore. The cosmic axis, the world tree, the primordial flood, the descent of knowledge bringers, these motifs appear across regions isolated by geography and time. Some propose a shared origin in early migratory populations. Others argue for convergent myth-making. But the striking detail in many of these narratives hints at something more: the transmission of a memory through archetypes, dreams, ritual, and storytelling. The work of scholars like Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and more recent researchers in cognitive anthropology suggests that human consciousness may carry deep patterns, inherited not genetically but culturally. These patterns could preserve echoes of experiences long forgotten, and if humanity indeed survived catastrophic resets, then the myths that proliferated after those resets may encode fragments of what came before. Stories about lost islands, sunken lands, star teachers, and ancient cycles might be the symbolic remnants of real civilizations whose histories dissolved in the face of disaster. Yet for all these clues, the physical world remains frustratingly silent. Stone crumbles, wood rots, metals corrode, entire coastlines lie underwater, and the deeper you peer into geological time, the more the Earth resists revealing its secrets. Paleoclimatology, geomorphology, and taphonomy all demonstrate how efficiently nature erases human traces. A wooden house disappears within centuries. A stone temple might survive a few thousand years. But a civilization primarily built of organic materials, a possibility rarely considered in mainstream models, could vanish entirely without leaving a recognizable footprint. And this leads to an unsettling thought. What if the markers we are searching for are not structural at all? What if the earliest civilizations expressed their knowledge in ways that did not rely on permanence? Portable symbols, ritual spaces, migratory pathways aligned to the stars, oral cartographies that mapped the world through stories rather than stones. In such a scenario, the disappearance of monuments would not indicate the absence of civilization, but a different kind of civilization, one tuned to cycles rather than permanence, memory rather than architecture. If this is true, then the evidence of earlier worlds may lie scattered across mythologies, symbols, and global alignments, subtle, elusive, and easily overlooked. But each fragment suggests the same quiet possibility, that humanity's story is far older, more cyclical, and more mysterious than the surface of our history reveals. That we may be walking on the remnants of forgotten ages without ever recognizing them. And if the alignments, symbols, and architectural echoes all point toward a deeper inheritance, then one must wonder, what other clues remain hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to the patterns beneath the noise? There is a point along this path where the mystery shifts, almost imperceptibly, from what has been forgotten to why certain fragments survived at all. And as you step into this next layer, the sense of unease deepens, not fear, but something quieter, like realizing that the shadow cast by a familiar object is longer than the object itself, stretching into places you cannot see. The more you trace the outlines of early civilization, the more you begin to notice that the world is filled with remnants that do not belong to the cultures we attribute them to, stones that seem too old for their surroundings, languages with roots that vanish into prehistory, technologies preserved in places where the cultures using them should not have had the means to invent them. And at the center of this quiet puzzle lies one of the most enigmatic inheritances of all, the strange persistence of knowledge that appears older than the cultures that possess it. This phenomenon emerges most clearly in the realm of early mathematics and geometry. Across the ancient world, civilizations developed complex numerical systems, precise geodetic measurements, and advanced astronomical calculations. But when you study their origins, you discover something unsettling. Many of these systems appear fully formed at their earliest recorded moments, as though they were inherited rather than invented. The Sumerians devised the sexagesimal system, base 60, whose influence still shapes how we measure time and angles. Yet the reason behind its adoption remains unclear. Why 60? Why not 10 or 20, as used in other early systems? Scholars note that 60 is divisible by an unusually high number of integers, making it especially useful for calculations. But such insight presupposes a level of mathematical sophistication that should have taken centuries to develop. Equally puzzling is the precision of early astronomical constants. The Sumerians, Egyptians, and early Indian astronomers recorded lengths of the solar year with astonishing accuracy. The value of approximately 365 fastened in 242 days appears not gradually refined, but suddenly present in some of the earliest texts. In the Surya Siddhanta, the year length is given with a precision that rivals modern measurements. How did early societies achieve this level of understanding when they lacked advanced instruments? Some argue for long-term observation across generations. Others claim it reflects older inherited data. But wherever the truth lies, the pattern repeats, knowledge appearing in its mature form, as if carried from an earlier source. You see this same phenomenon in geometry. The builders of the Great Pyramid incorporated ratios that align closely with P and F, the golden ratio. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to practical engineering. Yet the ratios fit too elegantly, suggesting a symbolic or mathematical intention. The megalithic structures of Britain and Brittany reveal precise geometric layouts that imply a deep understanding of circles, ellipses, and alignments. Alexander Thom, the controversial engineer who surveyed these sites, argued that their builders used a standard unit of measurement, the megalithic yard, with remarkable consistency. While many dismissed Thom's conclusions, subsequent studies have found patterns too precise to ignore. Whether by design or by coincidence, the sense of an inherited measurement system lingers. Consider too the Indus Valley civilization. Their urban planning exhibits an advanced understanding of geometry, drainage systems, and modular brick dimensions. Yet the origin of their knowledge remains obscure. Their script is undeciphered, and no transitional stages of development have been found. It is as though a fully mature system appeared suddenly, then vanished as abruptly as it emerged. Similarly, early Chinese cosmology presents a mature synthesis of astronomy, numerology, and geometry in the form of the I Ching, the Luoshu square, and the concept of heaven-earth symmetry. These systems appear early in China's history, not as primitive attempts, but as refined frameworks. A similar enigma exists in the realm of language. The oldest known writing systems, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Indus script, and early Chinese characters, do not show clear evolutionary paths. they appear complex from the start. Some scholars attribute this to lost proto-writing systems. Others argue that writing may have originated independently in multiple places. But the suddenness with which full writing appears suggests something deeper. The possibility that earlier forms of symbolic recording existed long before recognized civilizations, and that these early systems were only the latest refinement of an older tradition. The deeper you go, the more the anomalies multiply. Linear A from Minoan Crete remains undeciphered. Rongorongo of Easter Island appears far too complex for the island's known population history. The Vincha symbols of southeastern Europe, dating to the Neolithic period, resemble proto-writing yet appear thousands of years before the earliest known scripts. None of these systems have direct parallels, none have clear origins, and none fit comfortably into the accepted model of linear cultural development. As these puzzle pieces accumulate, a quiet hypothesis begins to emerge, that some knowledge persisted across immense spans of time not through physical artifacts, but through oral tradition, ritual practice, or symbolic inheritance. Knowledge passed not through institutions, but through memory itself. Some cultures have institutionalized memory in ways that leave traces. The Aboriginal Australians maintain songlines that encode not only geography, but ecological and cosmological information. Ancient Indian society preserved the Vedas through rigorous oral recitation, ensuring precision across millennia. In West Africa, griots memorized genealogies and histories stretching back hundreds of years. These traditions show that human memory, when structured properly, can preserve vast bodies of information without writing. If such practices existed in prehistory, they may have carried forward fragments of knowledge from even earlier cultures, fragments that later civilizations inherited without understanding their true age. This possibility acquires new weight when you consider the role of astronomy in ancient societies. The precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle, was known to early Indian, Greek, Egyptian, and possibly even Olmec traditions. Some scholars argue this knowledge arose from long-term observation, but others, noting the immense timescales involved, wonder whether such knowledge could have survived multiple cultural cycles. The alignment of many ancient structures to precessional markers suggests that early cultures paid attention to celestial patterns spanning lifetimes. Yet their insights appear suddenly, not gradually. It is as though the concept of precession re-emerged, not as a new discovery, but as a recovered memory. Even more enigmatic are the global flood myths. They appear across nearly every early culture: Sumerian, Hebrew, Greek, Chinese, Indian, Mayan, Incan, Aboriginal, Polynesian. Some describe catastrophic inundations, others recount worlds destroyed and remade. Many contain surprisingly specific details: mountains submerged, coastlines transformed, survivors guided by celestial beings or ancestral spirits. Geological evidence supports several major flooding events at the end of the last ice age: meltwater pulses, sudden sea level rise, the breaching of glacial lakes. Could these events have shaped human memory so deeply that echoes of them persist in stories told today? Some anthropologists believe so, but others suggest an even older layer, that these stories may encode memories from civilizations existing before the floods, whose survivors carried those memories into the cultures that followed. This brings us to the most fragile yet compelling thread: the possibility that the knowledge preserved by early civilizations is only the visible portion of a far older intellectual lineage, a lineage that may stretch back through cycles of collapse and renewal, leaving behind only fragments each time. If this is true, then the sudden appearance of advanced ideas in early civilizations may reflect not innovation but transmission. Transmission across vast temporal distances, surviving the rise and fall of worlds. The remnants of such a lineage appear not only in knowledge systems, but also in shared architectural impulses. The global recurrence of pyramids, ziggurats, mounds, and stepped platforms is often attributed to convergent evolution. Humans everywhere discovering that these shapes are structurally stable. But the symbolism of these shapes is too consistent to be dismissed. Mountains were seen as places where heaven and earth meet. Pyramids symbolized cosmic ascent. Mounds housed ancestors. These concepts appear across Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, China, Polynesia, and parts of Africa. Could this reflect a shared symbolic inheritance, or a memory of ritual structures from an earlier era? Another clue lies in the oldest sacred geometries: the mandala in India, the cosmogram in Africa, the medicine wheel in North America, the labyrinth in Europe. All encode circular, radial, or spiral structures representing the universe. These symbols are not identical, yet they share conceptual similarities. They appear in cultures separated by oceans long before maritime contact. It is difficult to explain their similarities through independent invention alone. Something older may be pulsing beneath them, an ancient conceptual map of the cosmos, transmitted across forgotten eras. Yet perhaps the most haunting echo of earlier civilizations lies in the ruins that should not exist where they are found. Submerged structures off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, sunken formations near Dwarka in India, the remains of stone walls beneath Lake Titicaca, ruins off the coast of Cuba detected by sonar. Many of these remain debated, uncertain, contested, but their very existence hints at a possibility rarely acknowledged: that entire landscapes once inhabited by ancient peoples now lie underwater, their histories erased by rising seas. And if the earliest civilizations lived along coastlines, as so many modern societies do, then much of their infrastructure may lie beyond the reach of archaeology. The ocean is vast and opaque, it hides what it takes, and when it rose at the end of the last ice age, it took with it thousands of settlements, stories, technologies, and cultural identities. What little remains of those coastal worlds may be the faint shadows preserved in myths, symbols, alignments, and inexplicable fragments of knowledge. And so the question quiets itself back into your mind, gentle but insistent. If these fragments are all that survive of earlier cycles of humanity, then what else lies hidden just beyond the edges of our perception, waiting to be recognized not as anomaly, but as memory? There is a strange quiet that forms when the mind lingers too long on what should not exist, yet unmistakably does. It settles like mist over the landscape of early human history, soft, cool, almost gentle, but beneath its stillness lies a tension that refuses to release. By the time you reach this point in the journey, the familiar boundaries of our chronology begin to feel porous, not broken outright, but stretched thin, as though the narrative we inherited was shaped around an absence too large to articulate directly. And as you step deeper into that absence, you begin to notice that some of the most enigmatic traces of earlier worlds are not found in ruins or myths, but in the subtle inconsistencies that emerge when scattered pieces of the past are placed side by side. They do not align, yet they do not contradict each other either. Instead, they create a quiet resonance, as though fragments from different eras are vibrating with the same forgotten memory. One of the most striking examples of this resonance arises in the study of early metallurgy. Conventional history places the beginning of the Bronze Age around 3300 BCE in the Near East. Yet scattered anomalies complicate this tidy progression. In places such as Sayonu and Navali Chori, evidence of copper working appears thousands of years earlier than expected, predating metallurgy in regions that should have developed it later. Meanwhile, in the Great Lakes region of North America, an ancient mining culture extracted enormous quantities of copper from Michigan's Upper Peninsula as early as 5000 BCE. The scale of their operations is difficult to reconcile with what we know of the region's population at the time. Tens of thousands of tons of copper were removed, yet no one knows where the majority of it went. There are no corresponding metal artifacts in the archaeological record. Some propose the copper was exported north or west. Others suggest the estimates may be wrong. Yet the mines remain, silent witnesses to an enterprise whose purpose we still do not understand. These anomalies become even more haunting when you consider the sophistication of early alloys. In the Indus Valley, archaeologists have found highly refined bronze, as well as evidence of advanced metallurgy, including the use of arsenic bronze, which requires precise control of temperatures and ratios. The craftsmanship of the bronze figurines from Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa suggests an artistic tradition that did not emerge gradually, but was already mature. And yet, like the civilization itself, the origins of this expertise remain obscure. The Indus script is undeciphered. Its earliest settlements appear fully developed. Its urban planning is sophisticated. And then, abruptly, it declines. The cultural memory dissolves. What lingers is a sense of looking at a civilization already old by the time it enters the archaeological record. A similar phenomenon appears in ancient China. The earliest bronze ritual vessels of the Shang dynasty contain intricate designs and precise casting techniques that suggest a long tradition of metallurgical experimentation. Yet the archaeological layers preceding the Shang do not show a gradual technological build-up. Instead, the sophistication appears sharply, almost as though inherited. And behind these vessels lies something even more haunting: the oracle bone script, one of the earliest known writing systems. Its characters appear fully formed, complex and symbolically dense, with no clear developmental precursors. Some scholars argue the origins lie in earlier Neolithic symbols, but these links remain tenuous. As with so many other ancient societies, the earliest texts seem to gesture toward an intellectual lineage that predates the culture that recorded them. It is in moments like this, staring into the sudden brilliance of ancient innovation, that you begin to suspect that humanity has forgotten more than it remembers. But the forgetting is uneven, as though shaped by forces that favoured certain remnants over others. Metalwork survives, but meaning dissolves. Symbols remain, but context vanishes. Systems emerge fully formed, but their roots hide in layers we can no longer reach. The puzzle deepens further when you turn to the science of archaeoacoustics, the study of sound in ancient structures. Across the world, early civilizations built chambers, temples and monuments with acoustical properties far too precise to be accidental. The hypogeum of Halsaflieni in Malta contains a chamber where the human voice resonates at exactly 110 Hz, inducing unusual physiological responses in listeners. The reverberations within Newgrange, timed with the winter solstice, create an auditory experience that some researchers believe was used for ritual or altered states of consciousness. In the Great Pyramid, the Granite King's chamber amplifies specific frequencies with eerie precision. And in Chavindahuanta in the Peruvian Andes, conch shell trumpets have been found that produce resonances perfectly matched to the temple's architecture, creating sound illusions that feel almost engineered to evoke disorientation or transcendence. What is striking is not merely that these structures exhibit unique acoustical properties, but that so many appear designed with similar intentions: sound as a tool, a medium, a gateway. It raises the possibility that ancient cultures possessed a shared understanding of the psychological or physiological effects of resonance. Yet if this knowledge existed, it left no written instructions, no explicit explanations. It manifests only in stone, as though the builders belonged to a tradition whose practices were transmitted through experience rather than text, memory rather than language. A tradition that may have roots deeper than the civilizations that later inherited fragments of it. Then there's the puzzle of the so-called soundstones found in Africa, Asia and the Americas, rocks that ring when struck, producing tones reminiscent of ancient instruments. Some of these stones were incorporated into megalithic sites, others stand alone, marked with grooves where centuries of human hands shaped them. In certain regions of Tanzania, locals continue to use these stones in rituals. It is tempting to dismiss them as curiosities, yet their global distribution and their integration into ancient cultures separated by oceans suggest a pattern, perhaps a memory of a time when sound carried meaning beyond communication, when resonance itself was a form of knowledge, a bridge between worlds. What makes the question even more complex is that these acoustic traditions often overlap with astronomical alignments. Sites built to resonate with sound are also aligned with solstices, equinoxes or star paths. It is as though early humanity understood the world not as separate domains, astronomy, geometry, acoustics, but as an interconnected system of relationships, a concept that feels alien to modern thinking, but may echo a worldview inherited from far older cultures. As this pattern unfolds, another thread emerges, a thread that leads into the realm of geology. The Earth's surface is scarred with traces of catastrophic events, massive eruptions, sudden climate shifts, abrupt sea level rises, impacts that shattered ecosystems. Some of these events correlate with cultural transitions. Others coincide with periods of unexplained cultural silence. It is possible, even likely, that earlier civilizations were destroyed by such events, their knowledge surviving only in fragments. Yet there is something unsettling in the way certain geological layers seem to correspond with mythic memories. Flood myths align with meltwater pulse 1a and 1b. Fire myths correspond with volcanic eruptions or impact events. Stories of darkness align with ash cloud winters. Even the idea of an axis mundi, a world axis or cosmic pillar, appears in cultures that live through periods of significant celestial change. Some myths describe the sky tilting, a phrase that has puzzled scholars for generations. Could this reflect real astronomical events, such as precessional shifts or unusual celestial patterns after a major eruption? Or could it encode memories from even earlier cycles of humanity, preserved through metaphor after the literal details vanished? It is here that the notion of cultural reset layers becomes impossible to ignore. Archaeologists identify periods where multiple regions experienced abrupt transformations in settlement patterns, tools, artistic styles, or symbolic traditions. Some resets are localized, others appear across continents. But what makes them intriguing is that they rarely represent simple decline. Instead, they often mark the disappearance of one symbolic system and the emergence of another. It is as though the memory of an earlier world dissolves and a new story begins, sometimes drawing on fragments of the old, sometimes wiping the slate clean. This raises a difficult but quietly compelling possibility, that humanity may have undergone cycles of cultural amnesia, losing vast reservoirs of knowledge each time a global or regional catastrophe struck. Survivors would carry with them only what they could remember, passing fragments of memory into myth, ritual, and architecture. The more complex the original knowledge, the more likely it would be reduced to symbol. Yet even in symbol, something survives, and when enough symbols survive across enough cultures, they form patterns. Patterns that whisper of deeper histories, patterns that reveal connections where none should exist. One of the most enigmatic of these patterns lies in the sacred numbers that appear across ancient traditions. The number 432, for example, appears in Hindu cosmology, Norse mythology, and Babylonian calculations. In India, the Kali Yuga lasts 432,000 years. In Norse myth, 432,000 warriors reside in Valhalla. Babylonian astronomers used a base number related to 432 in their calculations. Even in the structure of ancient monuments, proportions related to 432 appear with startling frequency. Scholars file this under numerological coincidence. Yet its persistence across disconnected cultures invites another interpretation, that the number represents a fragment of astronomical knowledge passed through cycles of transmission, a remnant of an earlier cosmic model. Similarly, the number 108 appears in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, in ancient Chinese measurements, in Polynesian navigation, and in certain European megalithic designs. Its recurrence in contexts related to cosmology, cycles, and spiritual practice suggests it was once part of a global symbolic vocabulary. Such symbols could easily survive a collapse, preserved in ritual when their original meaning was forgotten. The deeper you venture into these patterns, the more the edges of known history begin to shimmer, as though something lies just beyond view, something vast submerged beneath the accumulated silt of time. Not a single lost civilization, but perhaps several, rising and falling across tens of thousands of years, each leaving behind only the faintest traces, each contributing fragments to the great mosaic of human memory. And in that mosaic, scattered though it is, there may be clues about who we once were, yet the most haunting question lingers like a quiet echo through all of this. If these fragments truly come from earlier cycles of humanity, then what deeper understanding, what map of the cosmos, what knowledge of the earth, what lost sense of our place in the universe once existed waiting still to be rediscovered? There is a moment when tracing these threads across the vastness of prehistory that you begin to sense an undercurrent, something steady, patient, almost rhythmic, moving beneath the surface of human memory. It feels like the phantom pulse of a forgotten age, a signal so old and faint that it no longer speaks in words or stories, only in patterns. Patterns of construction, patterns of numbers, patterns of myth, patterns etched into stones scattered across continents, patterns that appear disconnected when examined in isolation, yet form a quiet geometry when placed side by side. By the time you reach this point in the journey, the world of early humanity begins to feel less like a linear ascent and more like the last visible layer of a palimpsest, written over older text, with faint traces of the original still bleeding through. And nowhere is this more striking than in the global network of megalithic structures that stretch across the earth like a constellation mapped on land. The existence of megalithic architecture is not mysterious in itself. Stones endure. Cultures rise and fall, but the stones remain. What is strange, however, is how many of these structures share architectural and symbolic traits, despite vast oceans and millennia separating their builders. You see it in the trilithons of Stonehenge, in the menhirs of Brittany, in the dolmens of Korea, in the standing stones of Senegal and Gambia. You see it in the astronomical alignments carved into the landscapes of Malta, Portugal, Scotland, Turkey, India, and Peru. You see it in the labyrinths of ancient Crete and Sweden, in the circular enclosures of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, in the complex mound systems of North America. When you place these sites on a map, the distribution appears chaotic at first, thousands of points scattered randomly. But then something subtle emerges. Clusters that mirror each other across hemispheres, alignments that trace paths along ancient coastlines, structures oriented toward the same celestial events, architectures echoing the same geometric ratios, and at the heart of these echoes lies the suggestion that early humans were guided not by isolated inspiration, but by something older, something shared, even if imperfectly remembered. This becomes especially clear when you examine the stone circles and alignments that proliferate across the British Isles. They are often attributed to Neolithic or Bronze Age farmers with emerging social complexity. Yet many of these sites display precision that implies not only geometric knowledge, but also coordinated long-term observation of the heavens. The Callanish stones in Scotland align with lunar standstills, a phenomenon that cycles every 18.6 years. The builders of these circles would have needed to track the moon's motion over generations, preserving knowledge through careful observation. Similarly, the megalithic structures in Brittany show alignments to solstices, equinoxes, and star risings with uncanny accuracy. Some archaeologists dismiss these alignments as selective interpretation, but it becomes harder to dismiss when you see the same phenomena emerging elsewhere. In Nabta Playa, deep in the Nubian desert, a stone circle dating to around 6000 BCE aligns with the summer solstice sunrise. The builders were nomadic cattle herders, yet they constructed a symbolic astronomical calendar. Across the Pacific, on the island of Tonga, ancient star compass traditions guided navigators across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. In the Andes, the Inca and their predecessors aligned temples, roads, and cities to the movements of the sun and stars with precision that rivals that of Egyptian or Mesopotamian astronomers. It is not the presence of astronomy that is remarkable, it is the convergence. Cultures that should have developed independently share a similar architectural vocabulary: circles, solstice markers, alignments with the horizon, and axes pointing toward specific celestial bodies. These similarities could reflect universal human curiosity, or they could reflect the inheritance of a conceptual framework older than any of these cultures, a framework passed down not through direct contact, but through deep memory. This idea becomes even more compelling when you consider the earliest monumental sites in the world: Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and the other pre-pottery Neolithic enclosures of southeastern Turkey. These structures date to around 900–600 BCE, thousands of years before agriculture, writing, or metalwork. Their builders carved T-shaped pillars from limestone, decorated with animals and abstract symbols. The site was intentionally buried around 8000 BCE, as though its creators wished to seal it away. What is most extraordinary is not the carvings, but the geometry of the enclosures. They are complex, intentional, and symbolically rich. Some of the pillars align with celestial events. Others suggest a symbolic cosmology that predates the earliest known mythologies. How did a hunter-gatherer society produce such architecture? Why did they bury it? And what tradition preceded its construction? These questions linger, unanswered. Yet Göbekli Tepe stands not as the beginning of civilization, but as evidence of something that came before, an echo, a memory, a fragment of continuity from a world that no longer exists. From these early sites, the geometric tradition spreads outward, Across the Levant, the earliest agricultural settlements adopt circular architectures. In Europe, megalithic builders refined stone circles over millennia. In North Africa, the prehistoric cultures of the Sahara erect monoliths that align with star positions before the desert expands. In the Pacific, Polynesian navigators create star temples and horizon markers. In Mesoamerica, Olmec and Maya architects build pyramids aligned to solar zenith passages and Venus cycles. The deeper you explore these patterns, the more it becomes clear that early humanity did not move through history blindly. They carried with them a symbolic architecture, one that stitched the earth to the sky, the seasons to the stones, the landscape to memory. The origins of this architecture are unknown, but its persistence suggests that it predates many of the civilizations that employed it. It is here that another thread arises, one not of stone, but of movement. Ancient pathways, often dismissed as mere trade routes, appear to trace lines across continents that are older than the cultures that later walked them. Anthropologists studying the dreaming tracks of Aboriginal Australia note that some pathways correspond to landscapes that existed before sea levels rose. In Europe, the so-called Old Straight Tracks, described by Alfred Watkins, follow alignments connecting ancient monuments, although his conclusions remain controversial. In the Americas, the Chacorn roads extend across great distances in straight lines, even where natural topography offers no practical reason for such orientation. These pathways seem less like routes chosen for convenience and more like inherited geometry, lines remembered from a deeper cultural memory, lines repeated across generations encoded into ritual, song, or movement. Some researchers have proposed that these networks may reflect ancient navigational or cosmological systems, maps of meaning rather than geography. Whether or not that is true, what remains undeniable is that many of these routes predate the civilizations usually credited with building them. Just as the stones carry memory, so too do the languages spoken by early societies. Linguists studying the deepest layers of language families, Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Sino-Tibetan, Austronesian, find hints of older structures buried within. Words relating to sky, earth, water, stars, cycles, and time appear with uncanny similarity across distant families. Some propose a proto-world language, though the idea is controversial. What matters is not the certainty of such a language, but the suggestion that deep structures persist across time, even when surface meanings change. Symbols survive, sounds survive, patterns survive, and so the question arises, what were these early humans remembering? What world did their ancestors inhabit? What knowledge did they carry through the upheavals that reshaped the Earth after the last ice age? To approach this, one must turn to the sea. Today, more than 2/3 of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. In ancient times, this tendency was likely even stronger. Coastlines offer resources, shelter, and trade routes. But coastlines also drown when the sea rises. Between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE, the world's oceans rose over 120 meters, swallowing entire continental shelves. What is now seabed was once dry land. Plains, rivers, forests, and settlements. Doggerland once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Sundaland encompassed vast regions of what are now Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. A lost coastal plain connected Northeast Asia to Japan. Large areas of the Persian Gulf were once fertile valleys. Submerged ruins have been found near Dwarka in India, off the coast of Japan, beneath the waters of the Black Sea, and along the shores of the Mediterranean. Some are natural formations, others show signs of construction, but even these constitute only a tiny fraction of what might lie beneath the waves. The absence of evidence in this case is not evidence of absence. It is simply the silence of a world the ocean reclaimed. If early civilizations lived primarily in coastal regions, their greatest monuments, their earliest cities, their most sophisticated knowledge centers, may now lie submerged beyond archaeological reach. The sea is a perfect eraser, but it is also a perfect archive, preserving what it buries in silence. And as technology advances, more of that silence may begin to speak. Yet the deepest mystery is not the stones, the pathways, the languages, or even the submerged ruins. It is the strange coherence in the stories humanity tells itself about the past. Myths describing cycles of destruction and renewal, myths of floods, fires, and forgotten ages. myths of gods or ancestors descending from the sky to teach agriculture, astronomy, or law. These stories differ in detail but share underlying patterns, and patterns do not survive by accident. What if these myths are memories, not literal but symbolic, of earlier civilizations destroyed by natural cataclysms? What if survivors carried fragments of their knowledge into the hunter-gatherer world? What if those fragments were preserved in ritual, symbol, and architecture until new civilizations emerged millennia later? What if the world has risen and fallen many times, each cycle preserving a few threads of the last? If that is so, then we are not the first civilization, not the second, not the third, perhaps not even the seventh, despite the symbolic weight of that number. We may be only the latest, the most recent chapter of a story whose first pages are underwater or buried, or erased so thoroughly that only echoes remain, and yet those echoes persist. They appear in the numbers carved into stones, in the alignments of ancient monuments, in myths told around fires long before writing existed, in the songs that map continents now submerged, in the stones that ring like bells, in the geometry of temples pointing towards stars. They whisper of a past that refuses to vanish entirely, a past that waits, patient and ancient, beneath the layers of time. And if all of this, these stones, these myths, these numbers, these resonances, is merely the surface of a truth we have not yet learned to see, then what forgotten world is stirring beneath the silence, waiting for us to remember? There comes a point in the search, somewhere beyond the stones, beyond the myths, beyond the strange alignments carved into the bones of the earth, when the silence itself begins to feel like evidence. Not an absence, but a presence hidden beneath erasure, as though the world carries a memory so old, so deep, that it's almost impossible for the conscious mind to hold. You begin to sense it in the gaps between known civilizations, in the layers of time that seem too empty, too still, too conveniently forgotten. You sense it in the geological scars that cross continents, in the abandoned landscapes that once sustained millions of migrating animals, and perhaps humans before them, in the ruins that are not quite ruins but remnants of something older even than the cultures that later built upon their ghosts. By now, the question is no longer whether prehistoric humanity lived through cycles of rise and fall, but how many cycles came before the one we call the beginning. And as you trace the edges of this larger pattern, a new domain emerges, not carved in stone, not encoded in myth, but imprinted in landscapes themselves. Landscapes that hold the faint signatures of lost engineering, ancient ecological management, forgotten megastructures hidden not in plain sight, but in the overwhelming vastness of the natural world. To see them, one must step back, not into ruins, but into entire regions shaped by hands we can no longer see. One of the most enigmatic examples lies deep within the Amazon. For centuries, the rainforest was believed to be a pristine wilderness, untouched, hostile to agriculture, incapable of sustaining large populations. Yet recent archaeological discoveries challenge this assumption. Beneath the thick canopy, LIDAR scans reveal geometric earthworks, vast networks of mounds, causeways, canals, and ring-shaped structures. Some form perfect circles spanning over 100 meters, others align along cardinal axes. Still others create patterns too large to perceive from the ground. These geoglyphs, hidden for thousands of years, suggest a lost tradition of landscape engineering. Even more intriguing is the presence of terra preta, dark, fertile soil created by humans using charcoal, bone, and organic matter. This soil is not natural, it is engineered, and it is ancient. The sheer scale of terra preta regions suggests that large, stable populations once occupied the Amazon. Populations capable of transforming one of the most challenging ecosystems on Earth into a managed garden. Yet archaeological layers associated with these societies remain shallow. The deeper you dig, the more the trail fades, not into primitive predecessors, but into silence. A silence that feels like a severance, as though the knowledge that birthed these ecological systems did not originate in the jungle, but was carried there. Carried, and then lost. Similar patterns appear in other parts of the world. In Africa, the remains of vast stone terraces lace the highlands of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, structures so immense that they reshape entire mountainsides. They are ancient, older than most recorded civilizations. Some have been used continuously, others were abandoned long ago. Their construction implies a mastery of hydrology, soil management, and long-term ecological planning. Yet little is known about the societies that first built them. Their origins drift beyond the horizon of history, into a time before writing. In southern Africa, circular stone structures, often attributed to early cattle-herding societies, span dozens of kilometers. Some align with solstice sunrises, others form spirals or geometric patterns. One site, often associated with the controversial name Adam's Calendar, consists of standing stones, oriented toward cardinal directions and celestial markers. Although many claims surrounding it are exaggerated, the site's actual age and purpose remain uncertain. What can be said is that it reflects an older tradition of sky-ground alignment, one that may predate the cultural memory of the region. Across Eurasia, thousands of tumuli, barrows and mounds dot the landscape, some large enough to be seen from space. While many have been excavated, a surprising number remain untouched. The earliest among them contain not simple burials but elaborate chambers, astronomical orientations and symbolic carvings. Their placement often suggests a coordinated network, landscape-scale architecture whose planning exceeds the needs of any single community. It is as though early societies were arranging the Earth itself into a map of meaning, a map perhaps inherited from an earlier epoch. Another layer of this quiet puzzle emerges in the study of ancient hydrological systems, canals, aqueducts, reservoirs, and irrigation grids far older than the civilizations usually credited with building them. In India, the remnants of vast water management systems lie beneath layers of sediment older than many dynasties. Some are tens of kilometers long, some still function today. In Peru, the Nazca people inherited and maintained puquillos, spiral wells connected to underground aquifers, whose true age is still debated. Even mainstream archaeologists acknowledge that some of these systems may predate the Nazca themselves. The pattern becomes even more elusive when you look at the so-called desert kites of the Middle East and Central Asia, massive stone structures that stretch for hundreds of meters, forming geometric funnels used to trap animals. These structures are astonishingly old, some dating back 9,000 years. They require coordinated labor, large populations and sophisticated planning. And yet, for nearly half a century, researchers struggled to understand their function. The societies associated with them left almost no trace of settlements or tools that match the scale of these constructions. It is as if the landscape preserves only the shadow of a population that once thrived there. But perhaps the most haunting of these landscape-scale anomalies lies in North America. In the Mississippi River Valley and surrounding regions, vast mound complexes rise from the earth, some forming precise geometric shapes, others aligning with solstice sunrises. The most famous, Cahokia, was home to tens of thousands at its peak. Yet older sites, such as Watson Break, date to nearly 3500 BCE, older than the pyramids of Egypt. Their arrangement suggests astronomical knowledge and coordinated engineering. But the people who built them disappeared, their cultural identity fading into the archaeological strata. They left no writing, no clear lineage, only the earthworks themselves, mute testimony to a world that predates its own memory. In all these cases, the landscape tells a story that the archaeological record cannot. A story of complexity where simplicity is expected, of coordination where randomness seems more likely, of inherited knowledge where innovation should have been gradual. It is as though early humans were rebuilding from fragments of a vanished world, carried forward through oral traditions, encoded into rituals, expressed in monumental forms because words were no longer enough. And yet, the greatest mystery is not the scale or the age of these constructions, but the suddenness with which they appeared, and the abruptness with which they were abandoned. Something changed. Something shifted on a global scale. Climate, yes. Migration, yes. But also something subtler. A fading of memory, a loss of coherence. Cultures that once shaped continents with purpose and precision began to scatter. Some retreated into forests, others dissolved during droughts or floods. Some retained fragments of their symbolic systems, others lost them entirely. Geologists and paleoclimatologists point to a series of environmental shocks between 12,000 and 4,000 years ago. Droughts, floods, temperature swings, volcanic eruptions. These events reshaped coastlines, forced migrations, and destabilized ecosystems. But environmental stress alone does not explain the deeper pattern, not just the collapse of communities, but the collapse of memory itself. The forgetting seems too synchronized, too widespread, almost as though humanity collectively walked away from something it could no longer hold. This shared forgetting appears most clearly in myth. The stories of lost homelands, Atlantis in Greece, Kumari Kandam in Tamil tradition, the Land of the Sun in Polynesia, Aztlan in Mesoamerica, may not refer to literal continents, but they all speak of something lost, something drowned, burned, or swallowed by time. Each culture tells the story differently, yet they all point toward a rupture, a before and an after, a memory of a previous world. It is in these memories that the idea of cycles returns. The Hopi say the world has passed through multiple ages, each ended by purification. The Maya describe previous creations destroyed by water, wind, or fire. The Sumerians wrote of kings who ruled for impossible spans before the flood reset the world. Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, vast cycles of decline and renewal. These are not scientific records, but neither are they random. They echo with the shape of something older, something that feels almost geological. Could it be that civilizations existed before the Holocene, before the stable climate that allowed agriculture to flourish? Could cycles of warming and cooling have fostered and destroyed early cultures along coastlines now submerged? The geologic record allows for the possibility. Tectonic uplift and subsidence could have erased entire regions. Sea level rise could have buried ancient deltas and plains. Volcanic winters could have shattered food systems. If early civilizations relied on materials that did not survive, wood, fibers, earth, light stone rather than heavy, then almost nothing of their physical culture would remain. What would remain are the echoes, the symbols, the alignments, the patterns embedded in the landscape, the rituals inherited by people who no longer understood their origins, the myths speaking of a time when the world was different. And this is where the idea becomes almost overwhelming. Humanity today may not merely stand at the end of a long line of forgotten civilizations, but at the end of a cycle much older than our current understanding of time allows. A cycle in which knowledge rises, disperses, fragments, and disappears, only to re-emerge thousands of years later in broken forms. A cycle in which humanity repeatedly becomes a stranger to its own past. If this is true, if early people were not inventing from scratch but piecing together remnants from a deeper memory, then the landscape-scale architectures of the world may be the last surviving traces of a knowledge system that once unified continents. A knowledge system that understood the Earth as alive, interconnected, resonant. A system that no civilization today fully remembers. And so, as this thread stretches further into the unknown, a single quiet question lingers at its edge. If these landscapes are the faint handwriting of forgotten worlds, then what deeper message still lies waiting? Hidden beneath forests, deserts, and seas, unread, unrecognized, but not yet gone, there is a threshold you cross, somewhere after the patterns in the stones and landscapes begin to settle into place, when the mystery shifts once again, not outward into the terrain of forgotten structures, but inward into the very architecture of human consciousness. It is subtle at first, like a ripple beneath the surface of a calm lake. You begin noticing that the most ancient clues are not always carved into rock or buried beneath sediment. Some are woven into the way humanity thinks, dreams, organizes meaning. They appear in our earliest symbols, in our intuitions about the cosmos, in the strange persistence of ideas that seem older than history itself. And as you step into this deeper layer, the boundary between archaeology and psychology begins to dissolve, revealing an uncanny continuity between the minds of early humans and those who came long before them. Continuity that does not align with the story of a species inventing everything anew, but of a species recalling something half remembered, half erased. This becomes most evident in the domain of ancient symbols. Anthropologists studying Paleolithic cave art have long noted that certain shapes recur across vast distances and unimaginable spans of time. Spirals, zigzags, lattices, nested triangles, circles with radiating lines. Genevieve von Petzinger catalogued 32 such symbols, used repeatedly across Europe for more than 30,000 years. These signs appear in Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, Apollo 11 Cave in Namibia, Sulawesi in Indonesia, and caves in Australia. They transcend continents, climates, and cultures. They persist long after the specific people who carved them vanished. Scholars argue these symbols represent proto-writing, an early visual system for recording concepts rather than language. But what is striking is their duration. Tens of thousands of years, longer than any known writing system, longer than any modern cultural tradition. Something about these forms survived through migrations, ice ages, extinctions, and upheavals. Something in them resonated so deeply that early humans preserved them without ever writing a manual or a rule. They simply carried the symbols, repeating them through generations beyond count. What if these shapes are older than Homo sapiens? What if they represent not merely invention but inheritance? An unconscious memory of patterns used by earlier lineages, Neanderthals, Denisovans, or even yet undiscovered hominin groups, whose symbolic practices seeped into the emerging consciousness of modern humans. DNA evidence shows we carry fragments of archaic hominins within us, genes that shape aspects of immunity, adaptation, even neurological processes. Could symbolism, too, have deep roots, extending into forgotten eras when humanity was not a single species, but a tapestry of hominins whose mental worlds overlapped in ways we can scarcely imagine? This possibility grows stranger when you examine the symbolic systems of the earliest civilizations. Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, the oracle bone script of China, and the undeciphered glyphs of the Indus Valley do not look like simple beginnings. They appear sophisticated from the start, dense with cosmology, numerology, and metaphysics. They categorize time, space, divinity, celestial order. They track cycles of stars, movements of planets, relationships between elements. And they do so with a confidence that suggests these ideas were not entirely new. You see it clearly in the earliest Sumerian texts. They speak of cosmic order as though it were a known structure. They describe realms above and below. They reference measurements of time that align with celestial cycles. Their myths begin not with creation ex nihilo, but with transitions, the separation of heaven and earth, the descent of knowledge-bearers, the reorganization of a world already formed. It is the language of inheritance, not invention. A story beginning in the middle of a sentence whose opening clause is missing. Egyptian cosmology exhibits a similar pattern. The earliest pyramid texts contain intricate spells mapping the afterlife in precise, almost mathematical detail. They reference cycles of stars and rivers of the sky. They describe cosmic hierarchies that appear fully formed. The architecture of the Old Kingdom pyramids encodes astronomical alignments with Orion, Sirius, and the circumpolar stars. Yet no surviving Egyptian text explains where this knowledge originated. The earliest records simply assume it, as if the foundation of Egyptian metaphysics had been laid long before writing began. Even more enigmatic is the Indus Valley civilization. Their city planning reveals a grid system with standardized brick proportions. Their drainage systems are incredibly advanced, rivaling those of much later societies. Their seals depict symbols and animals that seem to belong to a unified symbolic vocabulary. But their script remains undeciphered, and the origins of their knowledge remain hidden beneath the floodplains of the Indus and Saraswati rivers. There are no clear predecessors, only the sense of a cultural memory inheriting architecture, mathematics, and ritual from an older source. What makes these parallels haunting is that they emerge in civilizations separated by oceans, with no evidence of direct contact. It is as though the earliest cultures of the Holocene were stitching together fragments from a shared but forgotten intellectual heritage. And those fragments seem to cluster around specific themes: cosmology, time cycles, celestial navigation, sacred geometry, the relationship between sound and structure, the symbolic connection between earth and sky. It is almost as though early humanity was trying to remember something they had once known. This sense of memory extends into mythology. Comparative mythologists have long noted that creation stories across the world share certain patterns: a primordial chaos, a cosmic egg, a world tree or axis, a flood that resets the world, a cycle of ages, a golden era lost, a descent from stars or sky beings. These motifs persist across indigenous traditions in the Americas, ancient Vedic hymns, African cosmologies, Pacific Island genealogies, and classical mythologies. Some argue these themes reflect shared psychology, but others note their consistency is too specific to dismiss. They read like faint recollections of events or cultural structures that once existed. Perhaps the most intriguing of these motifs is the idea of multiple worlds or ages, a sequence of civilizations rising and falling long before the present one. The Maya spoke of 4 previous creations. The Aztecs described suns that ended in waters, jaguars, storms, and fire. The Hopi described 3 worlds destroyed by ice, fire, and flood. The Sumerians placed a great flood between antediluvian kings and post-diluvian rule. The Greeks spoke of a golden age, followed by the silver, bronze, and iron. The Hindus described yugas spanning millions of years. These scales differ wildly, but the pattern remains. Humanity is living in the latest of multiple worlds, and each previous world ended abruptly. What if these stories are not literal accounts of cosmic cycles, but symbolic memories of earlier human eras erased by disasters so profound they reshaped continents? Paleoclimatology supports at least part of this. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains controversial, but evidence of massive wildfires, melt glass nanodiamonds, and platinum anomalies points to a catastrophic event around 12,800 years ago. This event, whatever its cause, initiated centuries of climate chaos. Glacial lakes burst, ocean currents shifted, entire ecosystems collapsed, sea levels surged. If any complex coastal cultures existed before this event, they would have been wiped out or displaced. Their survivors might have preserved only fragments of their knowledge, fragments that later seeded the rise of the first known civilizations. Yet perhaps the most curious evidence of an older intelligence lies not in physical ruins or symbols, but in the mathematical constants embedded in ancient structures across the world. The Great Pyramid encodes P and F with shocking accuracy. Stone circles in Britain reflect lunar standstill cycles. Angkor Wat's layout maps the yuga cycles of Hindu cosmology. Teotihuacan's dimensions form ratios consistent with celestial periods. Even Göbekli Tepe appears to encode star positions. These constants and cycles were unlikely to have been calculated independently by all these societies. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that the earliest civilizations inherited astronomical and mathematical knowledge from much older oral traditions, knowledge accumulated over generations of careful observation, knowledge that survived catastrophic bottlenecks, knowledge that re-emerged when the climate stabilized. But the precision in some ancient monuments suggests something more, that these cultures preserved frameworks they did not fully understand. They remembered the form but not the meaning, a mnemonic without a manual. This sense of half-memory becomes even more pronounced when you look at the architecture of sound, the resonant chambers of Malta, the humming galleries of Chavin, the acoustic focusing of Rapa Nui's platforms, the sound illusions of Mayan temples, all exploit frequencies that affect human consciousness. These are not intuitive designs. They reflect consistent experimentation or inherited knowledge of how sound interacts with stone and space. Yet again, the societies that built these structures left no written explanations. The knowledge appears embedded in the architecture itself, like the residue of a forgotten science. All of this, symbolic continuity, mythic cycles, constants hidden in stone, acoustical engineering without textual record, converges into a single quiet implication: that humanity did not begin from nothing 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. Rather, humanity inherited fragments from an earlier world, a world erased by disaster or time, a world whose final echoes survive not in physical ruins but in the deep patterns of cultural memory. And if this is true, then we must consider the possibility that our species is living inside a vast cognitive inheritance, one built layer by layer across multiple forgotten cycles. The conscious mind may not remember those cycles, but the deeper structures of culture, myth, and symbol do. They whisper of ancient knowledge we can no longer name. They beckon us toward memories older than written language. Yet as these fragments accumulate, a new question rises, not about what humanity once knew, but why so much of it dissolved. Why do we possess only shards? Why do the earliest cultures appear already to be remembering rather than creating? Why does the world's symbolic vocabulary feel like an echo? And if what we have inherited are but faint traces of something larger, then what deeper patterns still lie beyond our reach, waiting, perhaps, for the moment when humanity becomes quiet enough, patient enough to remember again? There comes a point in this long descent through forgotten ages when the boundary between history and prehistory begins to blur, not because we lack evidence, but because the evidence that remains feels like the scattered pages of a book whose earlier chapters were torn out long before anyone alive today was born. You begin to sense that the world we inhabit is layered, strata of memory and forgetting, construction and erasure, knowledge and silence, laid one upon another like the slow accumulation of silt on a riverbed. And somewhere beneath these layers lies a story far older than our calendars allow, a story too fragmented to reconstruct fully, yet too persistent to dismiss. It rises in quiet patterns, in sudden ruptures, in mysteries that refuse to resolve. But in this next phase of the journey, it emerges most powerfully in an unexpected place. The realm of early technologies that appear not only advanced for their time, but anomalous when placed against the supposed trajectory of human development. Technologies that seem to belong not to the civilizations that recorded them, but to something earlier, something inherited, half understood, and at times seemingly reverse-engineered from older prototypes now lost to time. It begins with stone, the earliest tool of humanity, the simplest, the most enduring. Yet its story is stranger than it appears. Older one tools, Acheulean hand axes, Levallois flakes, all represent traditions that lasted far longer than most civilizations, but their sudden bursts of refinement, followed by long periods of stasis, make little sense under traditional evolutionary models. Some of the most advanced stone knapping techniques appear abruptly, with no clear transitional stages, and then, inexplicably, they disappear, replaced by cruder forms, as though the knowledge to produce them was held by a group that vanished, leaving behind only a degraded memory of the original technique. But it is in the later periods, during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, that the anomalies become impossible to ignore. Hard stones such as diorite, andesite, and granite require extraordinary force to shape. Modern quarrying techniques use diamond-tipped tools or powered machinery. Yet some ancient cultures carved these stones with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. In Egypt, the granite boxes of the Serapeum exhibit surfaces so flat and angles so crisp that even with advanced instruments the tolerances astonish. Drill marks in certain quarries show spiral grooves that appear consistent with rotary drilling, yet the tools available at the time should not have produced such marks. Egyptologists propose copper drills with sand abrasives. Engineers who replicate the process find that the ancient grooves are too deep, too regular, too rapid. In South America, the stoneworks of Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo fit together with such precision that you cannot slip a piece of paper between them. The angles are irregular, the surface is convex or concave, the joints interlocking in ways that seem purposeful. The builders appear to have shaped each stone to fit the next, as though working with an advanced understanding of load distribution. Yet no one knows exactly how these structures were created. The Inca, skilled as they were, inherited these megalithic foundations from earlier cultures. Some of the largest blocks, hundreds of tons, were quarried kilometers away and transported without wheels or draft animals. Archaeologists propose dragging with ropes and manpower. Engineers point out the friction would have been immense, the slopes treacherous. The puzzle remains unresolved. Even stranger are the polygonal walls found in Greece, Italy and Japan, sites like Mycenae, Alatri and Osaka, whose styles resemble Andean stonework. No cultural connection exists between these regions. Yet the construction technique is nearly identical. Massive stones cut into multi-sided shapes that fit together without mortar. These styles appear and disappear abruptly, with no clear evolutionary lineage. They seem to represent a technique transmitted across generations until it vanished, or perhaps revived after long dormancy. Then there is the enigma of Roman concrete. Modern engineers marvel at its durability. Structures like the Pantheon and aqueducts remain intact after 2,000 years, while modern concrete often degrades in mere decades. The secret lies in volcanic ash that creates long-term chemical stability. But what is curious is that the Romans did not discover this technique gradually. They adopted it suddenly, refined it quickly, and then, after the fall of the empire, it was lost. Medieval builders could not replicate it. The recipe only re-emerged through modern chemistry. This rhythm, sudden appearance, mastery, disappearance, echoes across many early technologies, as though each civilization possesses only a fraction of what once existed. The more you look, the more these discontinuities accumulate. Ancient Egyptian faience, a glaze requiring precise thermal control, appears early and fully developed. The Baghdad battery, long debated, suggests knowledge of electrochemical reactions. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck, functions as a celestial computer capable of predicting eclipses and planetary motions. Its complexity is so great that no comparable device would appear for another millennium. It did not emerge from a long technological lineage. It appears, fully formed, then vanishes. Likewise, the Damascus steel of the medieval Islamic world, a metal of extraordinary strength and flexibility, was produced using techniques that were lost over time. Modern reproductions only approximate its properties. Its microstructure contains carbon nanotubes and carbide formations that form under very specific conditions. Metallurgists still debate whether this was intentional or accidental, but the fact remains. A highly advanced technology emerged, flourished briefly, and disappeared, as though the knowledge behind it was fragile, inherited, and vulnerable to disruption. These anomalies form a pattern not of linear advancement, but of punctuated memory. Bursts of brilliance that appear without clear antecedent, as though early societies were rediscovering fragments of something older. And in the absence of written records, oral traditions become even more intriguing. In Polynesia, navigators used complex star maps encoded in chants and rituals. In Aboriginal Australia, songlines preserved geographic knowledge stretching back thousands of years, mapping landscapes that existed before sea level rise. Some Aboriginal stories contain accurate descriptions of volcanic eruptions that occurred over 7,000 years ago. These examples show that oral memory can survive enormous spans of time, if preserved through ritual and narrative. If earlier civilizations had oral traditions of similar magnitude, some of their knowledge could have survived long after their physical infrastructure disappeared. But there is a deeper layer still, one that sits at the intersection of archaeology, geology, and systems theory. It concerns the emergence of environmental manipulation so advanced that it blurs the line between technology and ecology. Consider the Khanats of Iran, underground channels that transport water across vast distances using gravity alone. These systems appear fully developed by 1000 BCE, yet similar structures exist in Oman, Yemen, China, and Morocco. Their origins remain obscure, some may be far older. These water networks are not simply engineering. They represent a profound understanding of geology, hydrology, and climate. Knowledge like this does not emerge suddenly. It accumulates, or it is inherited. The raised fields of the Andean Altiplano, constructed by pre-Inca cultures, form complex grids designed to regulate temperature and moisture, protecting crops from frost. They allowed agriculture in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Yet these systems fell out of use after the Spanish conquest, only to be rediscovered centuries later. Similar agricultural systems once existed in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Many are far older than the civilizations who maintained them. The more you examine these ecological technologies, the clearer it becomes that early humanity was not merely surviving, it was engineering the Earth on a continental scale. And such engineering implies not just labor, but knowledge, inherited, shared, or rediscovered. Knowledge that did not always leave material traces but shaped how people interacted with their environments. Yet the greatest anomaly, the one that feels like a soft pulse beneath the entire prehistorical record, is the speed with which symbolic, mathematical, and technological systems emerged after the end of the last ice age. Agriculture, cities, writing, astronomy, metallurgy, monumental architecture, each appears abruptly within a few thousand years, a geological instant. Some argue for environmental determinism, population increases, cognitive evolution. But the abruptness feels like something more, a reorganization rather than a beginning, a remembering rather than an invention. If this is so, if the Holocene civilizations were inheriting fragments of lost knowledge, then the question becomes, who were the original holders of that knowledge? What world did they inhabit? What technologies did they develop? And how were those technologies lost? Geological evidence suggests multiple catastrophes between 70,000 and 10,000 BCE. Volcanic eruptions, climate shocks, rapid sea level rise. Any coastal civilization, any population dependent on specific environments, could have been wiped out. Their survivors would scatter inland, carrying only what they could remember. Complex knowledge would degrade into myth. Technical systems would reduce to symbols, and over time, the symbols would outlast the systems. This brings us to the final, fragile thread. The possibility that memory itself, the deep unconscious memory of our species, holds echoes of these forgotten worlds. The intuition towards sacred geometry, the instinct to align structures with the sky, the recurrence of flood myths, the sudden appearance of advanced techniques, the strange familiarity of symbolic forms. All of these may be the faint residue of an older intelligence lingering within us. Not extraterrestrial, not supernatural, simply human. Human in a way we no longer recognize. And if that is true, then the technologies we cannot explain, the anomalies we stumble upon, the echoes that appear across time and continents, these may not be mysteries at all, but reminders. Reminders of who we once were. Reminders that humanity is older, more cyclical, more resilient, and more mysterious than our written histories can capture. But then comes the quietest question of all, soft as breath, ancient as the first spark of awareness. If these technologies and symbols are only fragments of a forgotten inheritance, then what deeper knowledge once existed? Knowledge now whispered only through anomalies, waiting in the silence for us to remember. There is a point in every long journey through forgotten time when the accumulated fragments begin to fold into one another, forming a shape that is not yet a picture, but feels like the ghost of one. By the time you reach this final descent, the echoes gathered from 9 parts, stones, myths, symbols, cycles, technologies, landscapes, begin to resonate with a kind of quiet coherence. Not clarity, but coherence. The sense that beneath the shattered mosaic of human history lies an almost imperceptible pattern, something ancient and patient, waiting beneath millennia of forgetting. And as you step into this last chapter, the question is no longer whether earlier civilizations rose and fell, but whether the world we inhabit today is simply another layer in a story that has repeated far more times than we can imagine. It is here, at the end of the arc, that we turn to the final and most elusive domain, the realm where the Earth itself seems to remember, a domain where geology and mythology, anthropology and cognition, ritual and ruin, all converge. Not in certainty, but in resonance. Because there are moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when the planet appears to hold the faint fingerprints of human ages too old to name, too erased to map, too fragmented to restore. One of the most enigmatic examples emerges in the field of geomythology, the study of how ancient myths encode memories of geological events. What began as a fringe concept is now recognized as a powerful tool for understanding prehistory. Indigenous stories in the Pacific Northwest describe mountains splitting open and rivers of fire flowing across the land. Memories that align with the eruption of Mount Mazama, which formed Crater Lake nearly 7,700 years ago. Aboriginal Australian traditions recall coastlines swallowed by the sea, stories that correspond to sea level rise after the last glacial maximum. Greek lore of Deucalion's flood may reflect real inundations in the Mediterranean basin. The Maori story of Te Rua Maui describes land sinking beneath the ocean in a way that echoes tectonic subsidence. These are not metaphorical stories, they are memories, precise, durable, astonishingly ancient. If myths can preserve geological events for thousands of years, then what else might they preserve? Could they contain fragments of cultural memory far older than we assume? Could stories of lost lands, Atlantis, Kumari Kandam, Lemuria, be remnants of events that occurred before the earliest known civilizations? Not as literal histories of sunken continents, but as symbolic recollections of coastlines drowned and societies displaced. If so, these myths may not be fantasy, but memory refracted through time. Another clue lies in the alignment between mythology and astronomy. Many early cultures possessed a deep awareness of precession. the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the stars to shift over a 26,000-year cycle. The Greeks attributed this discovery to Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE, yet evidence suggests much earlier recognition. Vedic texts encode precessional calculations. The Dendera zodiac in Egypt appears to reflect knowledge of shifting star ages. The Maya tracked celestial cycles with uncanny precision. The builders of Nabta Playa and Göbekli Tepe may have aligned structures to the rising of stars whose positions correlate with precessional movement. How did these early societies obtain such long-range astronomical knowledge? One explanation is continuous observation over many generations. Another is that they inherited the framework from earlier cultures. Yet a more intriguing possibility is that these star cycles were embedded in myths as mnemonic devices, encoded knowledge disguised as cosmology. If precessional awareness predates the Holocene, then the story of humanity may stretch across not thousands, but tens of thousands of years. The idea becomes even more compelling when you examine the global distribution of axis mundi symbols, the world axis, or world tree. The Norse envisioned Yggdrasil, the Maya described the Waka Chan, the Dogon of Mali spoke of a cosmic pillar joining heaven and earth. The ancient Egyptians depicted the Djed pillar. These motifs reflect a shared conception of the cosmos structured around a central axis, an intuitive metaphor perhaps, or a memory of the earlier sky configurations. The Earth's axis has shifted relative to the stars over long periods. Could these symbols represent an ancient awareness of celestial movement? If so, then humanity's earliest myths may be the residue of an observational tradition older than any known culture. A tradition so ancient that its context dissolved, leaving behind only symbols and stories. But the most haunting evidence for forgotten worlds may lie not in stories or stars, but in the Earth's surface itself, in places where geology and archaeology intersect without explanation. Consider Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. The underwater terraces resemble stepped platforms, though debates continue over whether they are natural or modified. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, lies a submerged city whose grid-like layout hints at human construction thousands of years before the earliest known urban centres in the region. In the Caribbean, sonar scans have revealed structures at depths inconsistent with any Holocene civilization. Off the coast of Malta, unexplained cart ruts continue beneath the sea. Individually, each could be a coincidence, erosion, tectonics, natural fracturing. But collectively, they suggest something more, the possibility that entire chapters of the early human settlement now lie underwater, erased not by neglect but by rising seas. If this is true, then the oldest civilizations we know, Sumer, Egypt, China, may simply represent the first survivors to rebuild on higher ground. The visible tip of a much deeper iceberg. This possibility aligns with genetic evidence. Human migration patterns during the last ice age suggest populations once thrived in coastal regions now submerged. The so-called Beringian standstill indicates that ancestors of indigenous Americans lived in a region now underwater for thousands of years. Similar submerged refugia likely existed across Southeast Asia and the Mediterranean. If these coastal populations developed complex cultures, their material remains would be lost beneath hundreds of meters of ocean. All that would survive are the echoes preserved in myth and symbol. But perhaps the most profound clue lies not in the ocean or the ruins, but in the peculiar timeline of human cognition itself. Anatomically, modern humans emerged around 300,000 years ago, yet the explosion of symbolic culture, art, ritual, complex tools, does not occur until around 50,000 years ago. Why the delay? Some propose genetic changes, others suggest population density thresholds. Yet an alternative possibility whispers beneath the surface, that symbolic culture did exist earlier, but was erased by catastrophes or bottlenecks. Surviving groups would later rebuild, carrying fragments of lost symbolic systems that re-emerged as the cave art of Europe, the beads of Africa, the carvings of Australia. This would explain why certain symbols persist across tens of thousands of years. Spirals, grids, triangles, serpents. It would explain why early cosmologies appear fully formed. It would explain why astronomical knowledge appears suddenly. It would explain why myths feel like memories. It is in this context that the theory of cultural inheritance gains haunting significance. Not biological inheritance, not simple diffusion, but deep inheritance. The transmission of ideas, symbols, intuitions, cosmologies across vast spans of time. Not continuously but cyclically. Rising, falling, vanishing, resurfacing. The way a melody might reappear in a dream, even if you have never heard it consciously. If this is true, then humanity may indeed have passed through multiple cycles of civilization. Some advanced, some simple, some coastal, some nomadic. And each time the world was reshaped by catastrophe, a few fragments survived. A song, a symbol, a story of stars, a memory of a flood, a geometric intuition, a sense of sacred numbers, a tradition of aligning structures to the sky. These fragments would lie dormant until the world stabilized again. And then, slowly, they would re-emerge, giving rise to what we call civilization. Suddenly, the strangeness of early cultures begins to make sense. Göbekli Tepe becomes not the first temple, but the first reconstruction. Sumer becomes not the cradle of civilization, but the cradle of the survivors. Egypt becomes not an isolated genius, but a restoration of ancient principles. The Indus Valley becomes not a sudden miracle, but the revival of inherited systems. The megalith builders of Europe become the last echoes of a prehistoric architectural tradition that once spanned continents, and humanity today becomes not the pinnacle, but the inheritor of a countless lineage. This does not diminish our accomplishments, it deepens them. It situates us within a vast cyclical story, one that stretches beyond recorded time, beyond the rise and fall of kingdoms, beyond the invention of writing. A story written in stone and myth, and symbol and silence. A story of memory surviving ruin. A story of worlds built, lost, remembered and built again. But even this is not the end, because as you look closer, you begin to sense that the fragments we have recovered, the symbols, the alignments, the myths, may not be the deepest layer. They may simply be the ones visible enough to notice. Beneath them may lie older, subtler traces, hidden in the Earth's magnetic record, in the genetic code, in the distribution of extinct megafauna, in the alignment of forgotten riverbeds, in the unexplained uniformity of ancient calendars. Knowledge we have not yet learned how to read. And so this journey ends not with a revelation, but with a quiet recognition that the world's deepest mysteries are not hidden far away. They are woven into the fabric of the world we walk each day. They are the hum beneath the ordinary, the echo beneath the known, and perhaps the only thing humanity truly lacks is the stillness required to listen. Because if we ever learn to read these deeper patterns, geological, mythic, symbolic, genetic, if we ever learn to see the world not as a line but as a cycle, not as an ascent but as a rhythm, then perhaps the forgotten civilizations of the past will no longer seem lost. They will seem inevitable. The memory of who we once were will rise through the layers of time like a whisper through the dark. And when that moment comes, what else might awaken? What forgotten truths? What ancient intelligences? What deeper worlds waiting patiently for us to remember?